Hello again, everyone. Tom Nagorski in the Cipher Brief virtual studio for a conversation about the just concluded NATO summit at The Hague and some of the outcomes and the impact going forward. And we're joined today by one of the great experts on Europe from the Council on Foreign Relations, Senior Fellow Liana Fix, who was at The Hague and joins us today from Berlin. And Liana, I want to start with a question about, you and I have talked before about the rift, or whatever you want to call it, between the United States and NATO. Donald Trump, a famous critic, cynic, skeptic about the alliance for a long time. And it struck some of us that a big outcome this week seemed to be, at least in tone, a very different message and tone from the president and agreement to commit to Article 5 and all the rest. How significant was this? Were you surprised by it? And if so, how did it come about?
Yes, I think it is fair to say that the NATO summit was a success, but against very low standards, right? So if the minimum expectation is that NATO doesn't fall apart, then that was achieved. Donald Trump committed to Article 5. But especially European NATO members paid a high price for that. They committed to 5% of defense spending, which in reality is 3.5% of really hard defense spending. The rest is, you can account a lot for the softer 1.5% of that. But the whole deal, the whole summit was about offering 5% to Donald Trump, flattering him, and making sure that he stays in the alliance. Of course, it's also in the interest of European NATO allies to increase their defense spending, but just from their security needs, they would have never come up with this 5% target. That was specifically for Donald Trump, and it worked.
Mm-hmm. And how much credit is due the Secretary General of NATO? He was criticized in some quarters when this message came out just before the summit. It was meant to be, I think, a private message to to President Trump. Effusive praise for the Iran strikes, and you're about to have such success here in The Hague. Do you think he played his cards well, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte?
I think he did. I mean, he only had 1 year to convince all NATO allies to agree and commit to 5% defense spending, and they have just barely reached 2%, right? I mean, the 2% goal from 2014. This is more than double the defense expenditure. So that is a remarkable act of coordination and persuasion from his side, of course, helped by the unpredictability of Donald Trump. And to be fair, if he has to bend the knee towards Donald Trump, all other heads of states in Europe don't have to do that, right? So it's actually in their interest to have someone like Mark Rutte, who doesn't have a constituency at home, that would criticize him for being too Trump-friendly. Other European leaders, if they would send a message in a similar way, do have constituencies at home that would say, well, that goes too far for us. But the brutal reality is Europeans have to do that because they're existentially dependent and will be for at least 5-10 years on the United States and on Donald Trump.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about that 5% target. On the one hand, as you say, it's a huge jump. It's not just a little number. But a lot of people are making the point, and I think you have as well, that as some people would say, now comes the hard part. It's a 10-year timetable, as I understand it. Do you believe that the commitments and the pledges mean that these countries really can and will do that? By which I mean, that's a hard thing, particularly for governments that have some other economic problems. Are they forced to do it, I guess, is part of the question.
So partly yes and partly no. I mean, from the perspective of European countries, having a resurgent Russia that is held by China and therefore poses a threat to NATO is enough reason to spend as much as they have spent in Cold War times. And in Cold War times, we had countries like Germany that did spend 3%, more than 3% on defense. So it's a return to Cold War spending for Europeans, which is not crazy from their perspective. And the NATO Secretary General has also made clear that this 3.5% of hard defense spending is related to the capabilities that are expected from Europeans. So he is saying, well, if you want to have a proper tank division in Europe, if you want to have proper land forces, airlift, you need to spend 3.5%. So he framed this as a need for the Europeans themselves. But the financing part is easy for Germany, because Germany is one of the few countries in the European Union that had a balanced budget and now can take on debt to come very quickly to the 3.5%. Germany now plans to be in 2029 at 3.5%, but all other countries didn't have a balanced budget and are already indebted for many other issues. And that's why Spain, for example, wanted to have an opt-out, because they said, well, we just can't cut all the social welfare for defense spending.
Yeah. And is that, do you think, I mean, what will you be watching for 2, 3, 4 years from now to see whether this achievement that has been made this week is really sticking and holding?
I think what I'll be looking for is if the sense of urgency in Europe remains the same. And to be fair, the sense of urgency doesn't only come from Vladimir Putin, it also comes from Donald Trump threatening to leave the alliance. If it were only about Vladimir Putin and European allies would still be sure that the United States came to their defense, they wouldn't agree to 5%. So to a certain extent, the disruptiveness of Donald Trump is helpful here. The only problem is we don't know if he's only disruptive for the sake of strengthening NATO or for the sake of eventually leaving NATO, right? So I'll be looking for to what extent do populists in Europe make defense spending a topic? Do they come up with claims like, why should we spend for defense just to please Donald Trump? We could spend for social welfare and make a deal with Russia, because the specter of appeasement with Russia is obviously one alternative to spending on defense to deter Russia.
Right, right. So a couple of questions about one country we really haven't talked about yet, which is Ukraine. And you were at the summit. From a distance, it appeared that, the country that has been at the heart of the NATO summits for the past few years, I don't know whether it was pushed to the back burner, but it seemed to slide a little bit down the agenda given the situation in Iran and everything we've been talking about vis-a-vis NATO spending. How does this look to you from the perspective of Kyiv?
Well, European NATO allies did some brutal and to some extent also cynical trade-offs. They wanted the summit to be a success for Donald Trump and to be about defense spending to secure their own security in the long term. That means that everything else, including Ukraine, but also disagreements over Iran, also disagreements over trade and tariffs and so on, just didn't play a role at the summit. The summit was designed to be focused on defense spending. It was not designed to be about Ukraine, and NATO allies also agreed to not publish a Russia strategy that was planned to be published at this summit, because they were not sure that they would agree with the United States on the perception of Russia as an aggressor in the Ukraine war. They also agreed to leave out Ukraine entirely out of the communique of the NATO summit. All past NATO summits have said that Ukraine eventually will become a NATO member since 2008, since the Bucharest summit. Now you can make the argument, well, if NATO falls apart because NATO allies don't spend enough, that will also damage Ukraine and the interests of Ukraine. But there's the other argument is NATO allies went for their own interest first, and Ukraine is only the second priority here.
Right, right. And then back to Russia for a moment. This is less about this week's summit and just a broad point. We've had many people on the platform talk vis-a-vis the Russia threat and make the point that Russia right now is suffering just extraordinary military casualty figures. Their economy is weak. And so the notion that Russia today poses a great threat to other nations in Europe seems a little far-fetched. On the other hand, we, just judging from things Vladimir Putin says and has said in the past, it can seem like a serious threat. How should we understand the current and future nature of the threat from Moscow for Europe?
I think General Cavoli, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe, put this very well. He said Russia was in a very bad position, but it reconstituted its military much faster than we expected, right? So it was much faster able to dig itself out of this hole. And the reason for that is primarily the support that it receives from China. It receives economic support, it receives military support. So from that perspective, even if Russia is not a threat right now to European NATO allies, if it continues on this path of very quick reconstitution of its military with China's help, it will pose a serious threat to NATO allies. And that's what they are concerned about. All the rates of tank production, of ammunition production, and so on just skyrocketed in Russia despite all the problems. And that is because it receives all the help primarily from China, a little bit from Iran and North Korea, but China is the main factor here.
Yeah. So last question, Liana Fix, is you've watched NATO, as we all have, but you with more expertise than most. 3+ years ago, after the invasion, it appeared that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was this seminal, unifying event for the alliance, in a way that the alliance had not been unified since the end of the Cold War. And it has had, as you've noted here, just a kind of rocky situation vis-a-vis the U.S. Right now on that spectrum, existential issue for them, great unity. Where do you see the alliance right now?
I think it's solid. It's still in a solid shape, but I don't think that we have already mastered all the challenges that I had. And I think I want to point to one specific issue, and that is US troop withdrawals from Europe. So the United States has announced that until the end of the year, it will probably review its force posture or publish a new force posture review, which means the Trump administration will decide how many troops they are going to withdraw from Europe. And that is, one can say, well, they have 100,000 troops there, right? So even if they withdraw some, how relevant could that be? But of course, in this context, it does send a political message. How many troops from which countries are withdrawn towards Moscow and other actors? And at the same time, it also poses a question to European NATO allies. Can they make up for this? And is the US nuclear commitment, the nuclear umbrella, still credible if US soldiers are not anymore on the line, or if fewer US soldiers are on the line in Europe? So there's still big questions coming up for NATO. It's solid right now, in a solid shape, but it's still a long time to go until the end of the year.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Liana Fix, Council on Foreign Relations, joining us in a way from Berlin and The Hague. It's great, as always, to have you with us. We really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine.